Lesson 18, Authoritarian Governments, Chapter 25, Section 2. Authoritarian governments include the People's Republic of China, Cuba, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So, first off, we're going to get into the People's Republic of China. Now remember, an authoritarian government does not allow for representation of the people's wishes. An authoritarian government is a government ruled by an elite group or an autocrat, one ruler, and they don't really listen to the people, so to speak. They just kind of run the show. In modern authoritarian governments have sham elections, elections where there are votes, but they really don't matter. So the People's Republic of China is an example of an authoritarian government, sometimes totalitarian. We'll get into the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian very quickly. Now, in China, communists seized power in 1949 after World War II, when a government backed by Western powers was weakened greatly by the invasion of the Japanese in 1937. So Mao Zedong will lead the communists, and he will lead China for the next 30 years. They will form not just an authoritarian government, but an authoritarian government kind of like on steroids, a totalitarian government. An authoritarian government controls the media to an extent, controls political speech, and controls who governs and influences the economic system greatly in the social class system. It doesn't necessarily get involved in people's religious views and that sort of thing. A totalitarian government, there's no aspect of life that kind of government feels is off limits or is uninterested in dealing in. So totalitarian governments literally want to tell you what to say and think about not only political issues, but other types of cultural issues. So communist control. China is controlled by a communist party much like the Soviet Union had been controlled. And this communist system includes government control of industry, farmland, and labor unions. Parallel systems of government. You have a national government, it's largely ceremonial, and then you have the Chinese Communist Party that actually rules China. This should sound familiar. In the first chapter of your book, we discussed Marxism and socialism and communism. So this kind of falls into that first chapter. Organization of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. The National Party Congress is the highest governing body within the Communist Party, but it really is just a rubber stamp for party policy. In other words, the oligarchy, the rule of a group, a small group at the top, is really making decisions, and this National Party Congress just basically, stamps their seal of approval on what the real leaders decided. The General Secretary is the most powerful party leader. Hu Jintao is the current General Secretary. We see a picture here of Hu Jintao with President Obama. The Politburo, or Political Bureau in English, the Politburo's Standing Committee, is the top 7 Chinese Communist Party leaders, and they will make political, economic, and military policy. So a small group of men at the top in China make the rules. So China's response to protests. There's been a number of protests in China. In Tibet, there is occasional resistance, and in Tibet they've cracked down quite a bit. But the one your book focuses on the classic example, is the 1989 protests by pro-democracy students at Tiananmen Square, which has a long history. It's part of the Forbidden City. A lot of political movements and actions are done there. Hundreds of unarmed pro-democracy students were massacred. Remember the time frame. This is when communism is collapsing in the Soviet Union. So you have these Chinese students who are pro-democracy who think the time is right in China. However, many are massacred, and others are imprisoned. Some are forced to flee China in exile. And the bottom picture here with the tanks, this is a classic picture about Tiananmen Square. The tanks rolling in to crack down, and this lone protester who just kind of walks out and stands in front of the tanks, and they stop for a while. Oppression in China. There is religious and ethnic oppression. Religious oppression includes Muslims and Christians, and also an organization called Falun Gong, which is kind of a blending of Buddhist and Taoist ideas, which are two religions that are very popular in China. Taoist is a native Chinese religion. Buddhism was borrowed from India. And here we see a poster. It says, the poster reads, "Firmly support the decision of the Central Committee to deal with the illegal organization of Falun Gong." At first, the Chinese government was okay with it, and then they changed their mind as Falun Gong became too popular in their opinion. Ethnic oppression. For example, the Tibetans I brought up. So they go after ethnic groups that don't seem to be conforming to the communist way. Censorship. Chinese censorship is fairly elaborate. They have the most extensive internet censoring system. Google has been having trouble doing business in China as a result of the censorship and trying to compromise with the Chinese government. And China is also known for human rights abuses. Some of the pro-democracy protesters were tortured and beaten and didn't survive the torture, for example. Diplomatic recognition. In 1949, the U.S. ended diplomatic relations with China when it was taken over by the Communist Party. But since then, we have recognized the Communist Chinese government. Here's a picture of Nixon and the Prime Minister, the Premier of China, Party Secretary, and in 1972, coming to agreement to deal with each other. Communism in China. Communism in Cuba. 1959, Castro's forces will overthrow the dictatorship of Batista. We see a young Castro to the right. In the middle, we see Castro just a few years ago. He's getting older. He's ailing. So he has, to the left, his brother Raul is now in charge. However, Raul's not too young himself. Castro will install a communist dictatorship in Cuba, thanks to the support of Russia, the Soviet Union. This will, of course, lead to conflict with the United States. Cuba is very close to Florida, has strong historical ties to the United States. In 1961, the U.S. will support a failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs shown in the map that was led by Cuban exiles who wanted to return to Cuba and get rid of the communist government. In 1962, we will discover, using satellite photos you see there at the bottom right, that the Soviet Union has installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and that will lead to a standoff, almost lead to, well, it came closest we've come to nuclear war. JFK famously led America through the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. maintained a trade embargo with Cuba after the collapse of European communism, isolated Cuba. So even though communism has collapsed in Europe for the most part, Cuba is, and Cuba's isolated, we've still maintained a trade embargo. We've still tried to put pressure on Cuba to change. So far, no go. So they have this economic crisis because they have a loss of Soviet aid. They haven't had Soviet aid in a long time. Sugar exports don't bring in the kind of money it used to bring into Cuba, and there's this continued U.S. trade embargo. But still, Cuba resists democratic reforms. North Korea After World War II, Korea is divided between North and South, much like Vietnam had been. North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union, so it became communist. Kim Jong-il is its leader today. He is the son of Kim Il-sung, its first communist leader. He's a dictator. He has very much a totalitarian government in place. North Koreans are cut off from the outside world, and they're told to give Kim Il-sung, son Kim Jong-il, their absolute devotion. There are posters of him everywhere, and here he is. He's not exactly the tallest guy. He likes to kind of poof his hair up to make himself look taller. He has these very distinctive glasses he wears. North Korean policies. Because of their policies, they have a great deal of economic suffering. They depend on foreign aid, and frankly, they get a lot of this foreign aid because of threats they sort of subtly or not so subtly make. So they have a robust weapons program. Here we see one of the buildings where they work on their nuclear weapons. They work on chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons, and very famously in the last 10 years, they've really put a lot of pressure on U.S. foreign policy because they have continued their nuclear weapons program. Islamic governments. Over 1 billion Muslims live in the world. Islamic teachings do not separate religion from government, and this will create kind of a clash with Western ideas about how government and religion should work. The Prophet Muhammad, for example, the founder of the religion, led the Islamic State during his time. And the Quran gives guidance on law and policy, so this is going to create kind of an interesting situation here. And you see here, this is a map that shows the darker the color, the higher percentage of the population is Muslim. So you get a sense of where Muslims live. Islamic diversity. Muslims live in the Middle East, China, Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, and so on. In fact, the largest population of Muslims is in Indonesia, which is in Southeast Asia, not the Middle East, which you would assume probably that the Middle Eastern population, some nation in the Middle East, would have the largest number of Muslims. Secularists, there are two groups that clash with each other in Islamic society. Secularists advocate a separation of religion and state. Fundamentalists, though, believe the legal system should be based solely on the Quran, so holy law, what is called Sharia. Fundamentalists look to the mullahs, religious leaders and scholars, to unite the Islamic world community. Many are anti-Western, seeing Western ideas as corrupting. Their main goal is to end moderate Islamic governments who have, in their opinion, westernized. The Middle Eastern nation of Iran. The Shah, or king, had built up this capitalist, oil-based, pro-Western friendly, Western friendly government and economy in the 60s and 70s, but it was really, there was a lot of corruption. So fundamentalists rallied around Ayatollah Khomeini. He's an exiled Shiite leader. There are two major sects of Islam. There are the Shiites and the Sunni. The Sunni are actually most Muslims are Sunni, but Shiites are the majority of Muslims in Iran. And so Ayatollah Khomeini is a Shiite leader. In 1979, demonstrations among the people will force the Shah to leave, and in comes Ayatollah Khomeini. So Khomeini's Iran. He will form a government that he believes is based on Islamic principles. This Islamic Republic of Iran will increase state power, so the government will get stronger. Religious leaders have the veto power over the actions of political leaders, and you can even see this today. Recently, the president of Iran said that these hikers who had been arrested and convicted of espionage would be freed, and it took quite a bit longer because he had to wheel and deal with the Islamic courts and religious leaders to get this to happen. Now we get to the government of Saudi Arabia. It's important for the United States because of its oil and also because key locations for military bases. It is a monarchy based on ideas, fundamentalist ideas, not surprising considering that Mecca and Medina are in the Arabian Peninsula. And there's no separation of church and state in Saudi Arabia. The mullahs are the most powerful group within Saudi Arabia other than the royal family itself. Saudi Arabia in the 1950s, the oil industry would make it wealthy and urban. There is pressure today for reform, including some pressure for democratic reform. There are the haves and have-nots. They're very wealthy at the top, and then there are a lot of poor folks in Saudi Arabia. This creates tension. Since 2001, critics point to indirect support for terrorism from fundamentalist Saudis. This is not shouldn't be surprising. Bin Laden was a Saudi Arabian, and a number of the World Trade Center plane hijackers who rammed into the World Trade Center were Saudi Arabian.